Hello, my name's Terry Harrison. I'm going to show you how to paint a bluebell wood with a barn. In fact, two of my favourite things. I just love painting bluebells and I just love painting barns. So put the two together, we've got a fabulous painting. First, we start off with the masking fluid. I put masking fluid on the fence, on the side of the trees. This is where the sunlight comes through onto the trees. And I've also masked off some grasses with a ruling pen and I've dotted in a few flowers on top of the background. And we're going to start with wet in wet background. So most of this painting is done in a wet in wet technique. So wet the background first with some clean water. I'm just going to bring that down over the tree. Carefully paint around the barn. And bring that down to the floor of the wood. Then some cobalt blue. So this is going to be a very misty light background. So some blue in first, drop that in. Bring that down like that. So paint over the trees. Wash the brush out. Some sunlit green. So it's quite a pale yellowy green. And drop that into the background. Touch of cadmium yellow. It's quite a bright colour. And just dab that wet into wet. Some midnight green. Now this is a dark bluey green. So in fact I'm going to add just a touch more blue to that. This is some cobalt blue into the dark green, and while that's still wet, just stipple the darker colour into the background. Take that up into the corner of the painting. This large group of trees here at the back of the barn, just stipple darker colour into the top of the tree and bring that down to the back of the barn. And similar technique here, wet into wet. Change the colour slightly, a bit more sunlit green, a bit stronger, stipple that into there. Now, key to this is knowing when to stop. Now this is beginning to dry and you can see that the colour isn't merging into the background. So it's wet here, becomes softer, but at the top of the painting it's fairly dry. Okay, just let that dry off. The next stage is the foreground. Similar to the top half of the painting, I'm going to wet the foreground. So, okay. Then I'm going to use the fan stippler. I'm going to start with the bluebells. Now for the bluebells, the colour I'm using is cobalt blue with permanent rose. So drop that into the wet, down to the footpath. And the bluebell colour just varies in tone. This is a little bit stronger. Drop that into the foreground, bring that down. Leave a gap for the footpath. Touch more permanent rose, so it's more of a pinky colour. That can go into there. Over the other side, and very pale misty bluebells just at the back of the barn out of the painting. Then, while that's still wet, some midnight green, touch that into the wet, So midnight green, I'm actually going to use midnight green and country olive. So it's fairly dark. Just touch that into the wet. Dark in the foreground. So you put the wash in first, then when it's dry, you paint the detail on top. So this is just a background colour for starters. Some more greenery coming down towards the footpath. So that's fairly light. Wash the brush out. Some raw sienna. That colour can go in this little field in front of the barn, like that. And with that same colour, just touch that into the background, onto the footpath. And again with the raw sienna, while this is still wet, just bring that forward. So there's the footpath. So it's all very wet in wet, fairly misty. With the darker colour, midnight green. So underneath this tree, it's going to be fairly dark. So start off with the dark colour. The shadow comes down the bank to the footpath. Dark underneath the trees on the other side. Just make sure we've covered all the white bits. Then allow that to dry. The next stage is the barn. I'm going to start with the roof. I'm using burnt sienna and just wash a light colour over the roof area first. Up to the top. This is the front part of the barn roof. Just drop a stronger colour into that. And with that colour, just run that down the side of the barn there. And while that's still wet, use the colour shadow and just drop that into the wet, just to make it look a bit more weathered. And let that dry off. With a mix of burnt sienna and shadow, put in the darker part of the roof. Bring that forward to there, to the top, still with that dark colour. Just put in the shade for the ridge tiles. While the roof is drying, we then move on to the barn itself. So I'm going to use some burnt umber and some country olive. So it's a greeny brown colour, not too strong. Wash that over the front of the barn, so it's one colour. As it comes down, just make that just a little bit lighter by adding some raw sienna. And a touch of cobalt blue, just to change the colour slightly into there. And dilute the colour so it's fairly pale, and run that through there. And on the door, go back to some raw sienna. And burnt umber with some country olive. The side of the barn, but this is going to be a little bit darker later on, so we just put the undercoat in first, and with that colour I'm going to drop that into the wet here. and just underneath the roof line there. Some raw sienna. Just add a little bit more colour to that, just to make it look just a shade more rustic. Then let the whole barn dry.